Hey everybody. Good morning. My name is Kevin Hanrahan and I'm the chair of Teagasc's Rural Economy Development Programme. And this morning I'm chairing a seminar at which we launched the 2019 Teagasc Sustainability Report. And we've a distinguished panel with Professor Jerry Boyle, the director of Teagasc, Trevor Donnellan, the chair of the Agriculture, Economics and Farm Service Department, and Teagasc's environmental economist Cathal Buckley, talking about how this report provides details on the developing story of the sustainability of Irish agriculture. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Professor Boyle to say a few words.
Thanks, Kevin, and again, welcome to everyone to this morning's launch of our 2019 sustainability report. And I think I would be of the view that sometimes there's an awful lot of heat, but relatively few facts generated when it comes to a lot of the discussions on sustainability in agriculture. And since 2013, using the National Farm Survey, we've been trying to shed some light on what is a pretty complex issue. In one respect, I think that it is complex, is the multidimensional nature of sustainability. And Cathal Buckley will set out later on that we embraced what we call a holistic notion of sustainability, which covers essentially four dimensions: economic, social, environmental, and the ability of farms to change and innovate. And that, in our view, is a critical component in the ability of farmers to address the challenges of sustainability. We have developed, of course, a very comprehensive set of environmental indicators. And we have pretty comprehensive coverage at this stage of all the gaseous emissions, the greenhouse gases and ammonia. And but we do have an ambition to extend the coverage of the environmental indicators, particularly to the whole area of sustainability. And Cathal again will address that in his presentation. The National Farm Survey, of course, is a really, really important resource, and we feed the data into what's called the Farm Accounts Data Network of the European Union. And it's interesting to note that the Commission have now committed to extending the concept of the Farm Accountancy Data Network to embrace sustainability, and they're going to rename it the Farm Sustainability Data Network. And we'd like to think that we've stolen a march in the Commission in that respect by essentially implementing such a framework for the last several years now at this stage. From my perspective, I don't want to steal either Trevor or Cathal's thunder, but there's a huge amount of really interesting information in the report. But what really jumped out at me is the extent to which farmers are adopting technologies that will combat emissions. And this, of course, is central to the research we've been doing now for several years that have culminated in the production of what we call the marginal abatement cost curves for both greenhouse gases and ammonia, otherwise known as the MAC curves. And of course, the challenge for us is to implement those technologies on commercial farms. And I think the report provides a number of indicators as to the extent to which farmers are implementing solutions that have been identified in research. And I think while there is a distance to travel, as will be evident, nonetheless, it's encouraging, for example, to see in dairy that 40% of dairy farmers are implementing what we call low emission slurry spreading, or the LESS technology. And while it's small, it still surprised me that that about 11% of dairy farmers are now using protected urea. A little over 40% of dairy farmers are liming on a regular basis, and about 26% of farmers are reseeding. Now, all of these indicators can, of course, be improved, and that's the challenge over the next period. And Teagasc will be bringing forward, in collaboration with the co-ops and the meat companies, and of course our sister agencies, especially Board Bia, a program called the Signpost Farms program, which will be dedicated to implementing these technologies on the ground. But before I hand you back to Kevin, I just want to acknowledge, first of all, the authors of the report, Cathal Buckley and Trevor Donnellan. Trevor will be speaking in a moment. And of course, all our colleagues that contributed to the production of this report as well. This report couldn't be possible without the dedication of our recorders up and down the country. And of course, for farmers and recorders, this has been a difficult year in assembling and finalizing the data because of COVID, of course. But I do want to acknowledge their effort. And in particular, I want to acknowledge the support of farmers who have contributed to this survey year in, year out. Without them, we wouldn't be able to assemble this vitally important information. So I'm looking forward to really interesting presentations, and of course, as always, a lively question and answer session. So I'm handing back to you, Kevin. Thank you.
Thanks, Director. Listen, I won't waste any more of our time. I'm going to hand over to Trevor Donnellan to start the formal part of the seminar. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that, Kevin. Just share my screen here now, and we'll get up and running. So this is just a short curtain raiser presentation. Cathal is the person who's going to give you the meat of the report that we're launching today. But I'm just going to talk to you briefly about some scene setting, I guess, putting today's report into a wider context, particularly in a policy context. But very briefly, first, for those of you who might be unfamiliar with the report and its origins, the report is derived from data that's produced by the Teagasc National Farm Survey, which began its life initially as an accounting framework to assess agricultural incomes way back in 1972. And it's part, as the Director has just mentioned, part of the EU Farm Accountancy Data Network, which is a standardized data collection set that takes place across the European Union at a member state level with the objective of establishing what income levels exist in agriculture. The Irish version, which is the National Farm Survey, the Irish version of this network has itself developed over time into a wider sphere to include, in particular, as has been mentioned already, environmental variables. And we've, since about 2015, we've been producing a sustainability report that looks across the full set of dimensions of sustainability. So we are actually ahead of the curve in the sense of measuring the wider sustainability with a wider definition in the ag sector. And as has been mentioned already, that is envisaged to be an objective within the Farm to Fork strategy, that this will happen at a pan-EU level, and that it will happen actually in quite a short period of time. So just in terms of the sustainability report, Cathal will be reporting across 4 farm systems: dairy farms, cattle farms, sheep farms, and tillage farms. And it's important for people to understand as well that these farms are categorized by their dominant agricultural output. And it is the case, for example, that farms that we would consider to be sheep farms may also have, for example, cattle on those farms, and equally farms that we would define as tillage farms could have some cattle or other type of enterprise also taking place on those farms. So it's important that people understand that farms just don't generally produce a single output, and that we categorize them by their dominant output. And that will become evident in some of the pie charts that you see later, that the emissions generated on some of these farms may actually be from activities which are not the dominant agricultural activity. And we have got our 4 sustainability dimensions, the economic one, which is at the core of the National Farm Survey, along with the environmental, social and innovation measures. So for 2019, we're reporting on some 129 indicators across the agricultural sector. In terms of the time dimension, we now have a full suite of data going back to 2012. The economic data set obviously goes back much further than that, but in terms of the environmental data, that richer environmental data set, we began to really develop that back in about 2012. So for the purposes of this report, we actually have 6 years worth of data. And we have a 3-year rolling average as well built into our data. And the reason for that is because you will get interannual variability due to either price shocks or weather shocks, which affect a lot of our measures. And to see the real trend that's actually emerging, it is useful to look at these over a 3-year rolling average basis that tends to smooth these shocks. So you shouldn't be taking too much from 1-year changes in these measures. You really need to look at the broader trend that's taking place. So Cathal, in his presentation in a moment, is only going to present a small subset of the results that are produced in the report. And to get the full suite of metrics, really, you should delve into the printed report itself, which is available now on the Teagasc website to download. So this 2019 report has been produced in the same year as the report for 2018. So this finally brings us into line in terms of publication of the National Farm Survey results and the sustainability report for the same year. We've been playing catch up in the last few years on that, but we finally have achieved that now. So in 2021, for example, the National Farm Survey for 2020 and the corresponding sustainability report will be published. Now, if we want to think about what's happening in terms of EU agriculture, well, we've seen it's been under pressure to be more sustainable from, if you look at the CAP proposals that emerged back in 2018 from the Commission, that set basically a direction, I guess, for EU agriculture going forward. And you see from that point on that the rise in environmental concerns is very evident in terms of what's perceived as important with respect to agriculture in the coming years. So environmental concerns around air emissions, biodiversity, animal welfare, and even increasingly human health issues are now becoming prominent. And this ultimately requires that we revisit the food production system, reimagine how things are produced, and do so in a way that is more environmentally friendly, I guess, ultimately. So food production has to take place that meets both the economic, social, and environmental goals. And collectively, we refer to these obviously as sustainability measures. In terms of the CAP, otherwise, we're talking about a CAP that is ultimately going to be more targeted around environmental issues, aligning spending to a greater extent to environmental goals. And there's also going to be a shift in orientation more towards both in policy design and implementation towards the delivery of outcomes. So, there will be a greater focus on measuring that improved environmental objectives, for example, have been achieved. Ultimately, that this requires at an overall EU level that we have better indicators for agriculture, and that is to measure progress in a wide range of areas, and ultimately to assist in the measurement of the effectiveness of policy. Also, what has emerged more recently, obviously, is the EU Green Deal, and within that EU Green Deal, the Farm to Fork initiative, which I guess doubles on the ball, if you like, really, in terms of some of the messages that were coming out of the whole CAP reform negotiation process. So some of the key issues that are in that Farm to Fork initiative include the need to address the climate footprint of the food chain, not just at the level of agriculture inside the farm gate, but beyond that as well. There's also a commitment at an EU level for the EU to demonstrate global leadership in terms of the transformation of the global food chain. And while the EU aims to demonstrate leadership in that regard, it also wants to maintain its international competitiveness. There's a strong emphasis as well on recycling, ultimately, to operationalize new opportunities in the bioeconomy, to find new uses for agricultural outputs that could enhance the incomes of farmers, and to ensure that we have ultimately a food chain that is resistant to shocks of all types. So within that EU Farm to Fork strategy, there are some prominent actions that are required, and I've just picked out a selection of those there for the purposes of this short presentation. And you can see there are commitments with respect to reducing pesticide use, addressing nutrient losses, and achieving an overall reduction in the usage of fertilizers, a commitment with respect to antimicrobials, and also a pan-EU commitment with respect to increasing the area of land in organic agriculture. And there are a lot of actions suggested in the Farm to Fork strategy. This is just a few that I've cherry-picked for the purposes of this presentation. And just to finish, just to give you a kind of a short-term calendar, even in terms of some of the required actions that are out there. For example, there's a short-term commitment to develop a 5-year action plan for the organic sector that will address both the demand for organic products and the supply of organic products in the European Union. There's a commitment in 2021 to provide revised regulations on plant protection products, and also to develop an action plan on nutrient management. And in 2022, a commitment to revise the Sustainable Pesticides Directive, and at that point as well, to put into place the mechanisms that will develop a farm to sustainability data network, which will effectively transform what is there presently in terms of the farm accountancy data network into a more holistic measure of sustainability that better incorporates, in particular, the environmental metrics. So you'll see in the presentation that follows that other member states are effectively going to have to begin to produce some of the metrics that we already have here in this country. So I'll leave it at that, Kevin, and I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, Trevor. I'm not going to dwell too long, but to pass on the mic and the screen to my colleague Cathal Buckley, who will take us through the detail of the results within the report, some of the results within the report, and to stress that everybody should start to dig into the report itself when they get a chance. Cathal.
Thanks, Kevin. Okay, so this is the 2019 report. In terms of an overview of the presentation, just going to quickly go through the National Farm Survey sample profile, as there's some important issues there to point out in terms of how the results pan out down the line. Go through some of the methodology results, speak to the ongoing development of the indicators, and finish up with a summary conclusion. Okay, starting with the profile of the sample in 19. So we have nearly 860 farms representing 91,000 farms nationally. We have a weighting factor from the Central Statistics Office. So you can see there, that's the portion of different systems represented. We're looking at dairy, cattle, sheep, and tillage systems here today. A couple of things I just want to bring your attention to, because it'll be informative in terms of interpreting the results later on, is that dairy farms and tillage farms, their farm sizes are a good bit larger than the cattle and sheep systems. And also, as Trevor has noted earlier on, even though they're kind of regarded as specialist sheep and tillage systems, there are significant cattle livestock units on these farms. And again, that's informative when it comes to looking at the results later on. Also, just to note, like that, there's a significant amount of cattle livestock units on dairy farms as well. But it's just the way these are classified. These are essentially, the majority of these are kind of replacements for the dairy herd and not a cattle enterprise per se. So, and then the final kind of second to last column looks at the total livestock units. So you can see there, dairying is operating at a lot more higher intensity, as seen by the last line of stacking rates, than the other farm systems. So, okay, some presentational points when it comes to the results. Okay, when you see a bar chart like that, essentially look at we're showing the 90% distribution from the 90th percentile to the 10th. The median is the 50th in the middle, and the box is the interquartile range from 25th to 75th percentile. So essentially, we're looking at the distribution of results when you see a box plot. When you see a result like with a bar chart like that, we've broken down the data into top, middle, and bottom by economic performance based on gross margin per hectare. So it's kind of it's slicing and dicing the data based on economic returns per hectare. I just want to, I suppose, outline the colours throughout the presentation. The colours will remain the same. Dairy will be blue, cattle will be red, sheep will be purple, and tillage will be green. And when you see a chart like this, as Trevor has outlined earlier, it's a 3-year rolling average result. So essentially, it's looking at the time series. So as Trevor said, it's kind of trying to look at that signal as opposed to noise in the data. And for example, the first column there, 2012 to 2014. That data point is an average of 2012, 13, and 14. Okay, so before I start, I should say that we conceptualize sustainability as a 3-legged stool where you have the economic pillar, the social pillar, and the environmental pillar, with innovation as kind of a wraparound stabilizer for the stool. So none of the 3 dimensions are more important than the other. A sustainable agriculture sits in the middle of those 4 dimensions. So I'm going to start with the economic sustainability dimensions. Now, I'm not going to dwell too long on these because these are extensively reported in the regular National Farm Survey report. We have 6 of them. The first 3 are on a per hectare basis: gross output, gross margin, and family farm income, the market orientation, economic viability, and returns to labour. So, okay, there's a lot of detail on this diagram. I don't want to go through it in huge detail. On the left-hand side, you'll see the 2019 results for each of the farm systems. On the right-hand side, you'll see the temporal trend. This is gross output, gross margin, all the per hectare measures, essentially family farm income. The point I want to make here is that dairy farms are consistently returning a lot higher returns than the other systems. Tillage is second extensively across the 3, and the cattle and sheep mirror each other and are very much towards the bottom of the distribution when it comes to these per hectare returns. That's not a new story, and essentially has been reported through the regular National Farm Survey report. In terms of productivity of labour, okay, the gap narrows a bit when you look at per labour unit. Because, dairying requires a lot more labour than the other farm systems, and we'll see that a little bit later on. And tillage less so than dairy. So the gap between dairy and tillage on a returns to labour basis narrows. But then you have the cattle and sheep at the bottom, and are consistently at the bottom and not deviating a whole lot from their returns to labour in the temporal sense. You can see the gap between dairy and the others is tending to increase through time. The other point I want to make is that the averages are being presented in the top 2 slides, but there is a huge variability across systems, but even within systems. So at the bottom, you're seeing the top, middle, and bottom across dairy, tillage, cattle, and sheep. So even within each system, there's huge variability in terms of returns to labour. Okay, so economic viability, I suppose we start with a definition. Farms are defined as viable if they can return the minimum wage for the labour employed plus a 5% return on land-based assets. So it's a binary 1-0. If they can meet that bar, they're viable. If they can't, they're non-viable. So again, dairying is coming out consistently as on top of the viability scales. Circa about 75 to 80% year on year of dairy farms are meeting that threshold. It's about 60-65 for tillage, but for cattle and sheep, it's down below 25% year on year on average. It tends, some years are better than others, but it doesn't deviate a whole pile from around the 20-25%. Okay, so moving on to the social sustainability indicators. Then we have 5 of them: household vulnerability, isolation risk, high age profile, levels of agricultural education, and hours worked on the farm. So again, I'm not going to dwell, I'm going to pick out a couple of them because they don't tend to vary that much year on year, to be fair. So I'll start with the household vulnerability indicator. So what, again, in terms of definition, it builds on the previous one, the economic viability one. So if a farm isn't viable, does it have an off-farm job? So if it meets the viability, or not, if it doesn't meet the viability but has an off-farm job, it's considered non-vulnerable. But if it doesn't meet the viability target and it doesn't have enough, the farm doesn't have enough employment, then it's considered vulnerable. So again, we're looking at lower levels of vulnerability in the dairy and the tillage systems, about 10-12% for dairy, about 15 or so for tillage, whereas the cattle and sheep systems are in the order of 40 to 45% year on year of are considered vulnerable because they're not achieving viability and there's no farm employment on the farm. And the final one I want to look at on the social sustainability side is hours worked on the farm in terms of workload. Okay, it doesn't include off-farm jobs, and significant amount of the cattle and sheep farms have off-farm employment. But in terms of labour required on the farm, you can see the dairying, although they have higher economic returns, they also have a higher labour requirement. So you can see that in the region of about 2,400 hours per annum requirement versus about 1,500 for the other systems. So although there's higher returns, there's also higher labour required on those dairy farms. Director mentioned extensively in his opening about we're looking at innovation, and a lot of the innovation indicators are quite system specific in terms of like dairying or the milk recording and so on. But there are a few that are across the system divide, I guess. And there's 2 points I want to make here in terms of some of the innovation indicators. Generally speaking, they can talk about causality, but generally speaking, the farms who engage with their best practices or the innovations tend to have higher economic returns. You can see top, middle, and bottom, and generally there's a downward sliding scale. The second point I want to make in terms of, as the director has said, we're now in a position to track some of the technologies that are including, that we're promoting, like low emission slurry spreading and protected urea in the sustainability report going forward. So the third column there, you can see the protected urea. It's a large part of the recent ammonia MAC. And you can see we've a good bit of work to do in terms of getting farmers to substitute over to protected urea. But we're now in a position to track that change so farmers can get credit for it, and we can see what's happening at a farm scale across the various systems with this reporting mechanism. Okay, so moving on to the final leg of the stool in terms of environmental sustainability. So we report on gaseous emissions, greenhouse gases and ammonia. We report on risk to water quality through the use of nitrogen and phosphorus, and we're reporting, we are developing a biodiversity indicator. We're not quite there yet, and COVID-19 has kind of, this year has put a handbrake on, but we are looking at developing the biodiversity indicators for our NFS farms, and I'll speak a little bit about this later on. In all, we have 13 indicators across 13 environmental indicators across the various farm systems. Greenhouse gases on a farm per hectare and a kilogram of output basis. Energy greenhouse gas as well as agriculture. We're looking at ammonia, again, ammonia emissions per farm, per hectare and per kilogram of output. On the risk to water quality side, we're looking at the NP balances, which are kind of all our things being equal, a risk to water quality. we're also looking at agronomic efficiency in terms of nitrogen use efficiency and phosphorus use efficiency, how much of those nutrients are being retained on the farm. So in terms of methodological approach, we have what we need in terms of activity data from the National Farm Survey to look at these various environmental dimensions. And in terms of greenhouse gases, we're putting all of the results into common currency of CO2 equivalents. So the main method, the primary method we're using is the IPCC National Inventory approach for all farm systems. So we have all the data we need for that. We also have, we're also reporting a life cycle analysis result for the dairy system based on work of Owen O'Brien, Shannon's colleague, now based in Johnson Castle. So he has an LCA model, and it's been adapted to take data from the National Farm Survey and to run it through his model. So we have results from an LCA basis as well as an IPCC basis for GHG. For ammonia, again, we're using the national inventories approach. So we're mimicking essentially what the approach that the EPA uses to report ammonia at a national level. And on a nitrogen and phosphorus basis, we're using an input-output based accounting, tracking inputs through in and out through the farm gate based on, and that approach has been internationally peer reviewed and accepted. So in terms of agricultural GHG emissions, so I said we're reporting on a per farm and per hectare basis. And essentially this is, it represents kind of an absolute emissions, two absolute emissions metrics on greenhouse gases. We're also reporting on a per kilogram output basis, be it milk or meat, and on a per euro of output basis. So it's kind of interacting the GHG with the economic. So the two in the red essentially are absolute measures, and the two in blue are kind of emissions intensity measures, and we report on both across the systems. Okay, so starting with dairying, and in 2019, we're looking at just over 500 tons of CO2 being generated on dairy farms. So you can see the dairy, the blue part is what's contributed to milk production, and the major other part in is the cattle. As I said earlier, a lot of these cattle are not a cattle enterprise as such, they're replacements for the dairy herd, since it's the way that the National Farm Survey works. But those emissions are based on replacements and some cull cows. So when you contrast that with the other farm systems, dairying is about four times larger than your cattle, your sheep, or your tillage systems in terms of their overall farm level emissions. And another issue, another thing I'd like to draw your attention to is on the cattle and the tillage farms. Even though they're the sheep and tillage farms, even though they're classified as sheep and tillage, the majority of the emissions are coming from a cattle enterprise on those farms. So the cattle is driving the emissions on those farms. Taking the farm level metric and looking at it through time, CO2 of farms across the timeline. The non-dairy systems are generally static, if not declining. Tillage and cattle and sheep a little bit decline towards the end of the time period. But you can see at the top there, the dairying has increased year on year, especially since quotas were abolished. So there is a definitive signal there in terms of what dairy farms are doing. Some of the increases in emissions on dairy side at an aggregate level will be offset by the non-dairy systems because they're declining. But the story is quite, the story is quite clear that the dairy systems are increasing their emissions versus the other systems. Okay, then the disparity isn't as big when you look at the emissions on a per hectare basis, because as I said earlier, dairy farms have larger farm sizes, so the emissions are spread over more hectares essentially. It's the relativity between dairy and tillage remains the same because they have similar farm sizes, but the gap between as dairy and cattle and sheep farms narrows. They're about dairy farms twice the emissions of cattle and about 3 times for tillage farms per hectare basis. Again, the trend is that non-dairy systems are relatively static, not declining, and the dairy farms, their per hectare emissions are creeping up. Okay, contrast that then with GHG per euro of output generated. So you're kind of interacting the emissions with your economic sustainability, and the story flips in somewhat in that okay, tillage has the best or has the strongest result because of lower emissions and the second highest revenue generating capacity. Dairy comes out second because even though it has higher emissions, it has very strong revenue generating capacity. Whereas the cattle and the sheep farms, are cattle on top, sheep second, they have their emissions are lower than dairy, but they're very low income generating capacity. So they on a unit of per euro of output generated, they're coming out on top. Okay, so look, you've seen from the previous couple of slides that the non-dairy systems are remaining relatively static, but the increase is coming in the dairy farms. So I suppose I wanted to look at what's driving that increase in absolute emissions. So if you can break down dairy absolute emissions into three components: kilograms of milk produced per cow, by the footprint of that milk, by the number of cows. I'm using a standard kilogram of milk, fat and protein corrected milk, standardized at 4% fat, 3% protein. So if you look at the first component there, kilograms of fat and protein corrected milk per cow, over the time series, it's actually increasing. So that's an efficiency gain. Farmers are getting more milk from for each of their cows on their farm. The second component is the carbon footprint of that milk, and that's declining, which is again year on year on the slide. Again, that's an efficiency gain. They're producing more milk. They're producing milk at a lower carbon intensity. So that's an efficiency gain. That's a good news story. What's driving the overall absolute emissions is the herd sizes. So you can see from around about quota abolition plan 2013, 2015, herd sizes are creeping up. So the efficiency gains achieved in output per cow and emissions intensity are essentially being overridden by the increase in the herd size. I suppose just to reinforce that, I've broken out the dairy farm emissions by their IPCC-based components. So you can see there at top is the enteric fermentation component, which is essentially driven by a number of animals, ruminant animals. You can see the rest of them are relatively increasing somewhat, but the main driving force and the main component of the overall per hectare emissions on dairy farms is this enteric fermentation component. Okay, so I said earlier that we have an LCA-based model from Donnellan O'Brien. That model is also implemented through the Borbia SDAS, the Orange Green Borbia SDAS program. The model is identical. Okay, we collect the data in different ways. We cross-compare the results on a farm and an aggregate basis, and the results year on year are tracking. To be honest, okay, they're not identical, but the direction of travel the farm level is quite close, and the direction of travel is very much similar. So that's good external validity for both ourselves and Borbia, and that the results are quite close and are tracking in terms of direction. Just want to say in terms of cattle and sheep farms, their emissions intensity is also improving in terms of their CO2 per kg of live weight beef and sheep produced is also declining. So they're becoming more carbon efficient in how they produce their kilogram of output. But just want to say that the better farmers economically tend to have the lower carbon footprint production in terms of beef and sheep meat, and there is significant variability across the sample as well. So the key point is that the better performers tend to produce the product at a lower carbon intensity, without carbon footprint. Okay, so moving on to ammonia. Again, we're reporting ammonia emissions on a per farm and a per hectare basis, as well as a kilogram of output and a euro of output basis. So again, the numbers in red can be considered as absolute emissions, and the metrics in blue can be considered emissions intensity. Okay, the relativity compared to ammonia compared to greenhouse gases, the differential between dairy and non-dairy systems is actually larger for ammonia. So it's about 4 times, dairy farms have 4 times the emissions on a per farm basis, cattle farms, and it's 5 times that of tillage farms and 6 times that of sheep farms. So and it's been driven by essentially the intensity of dairying versus the other systems. Again, I want to point out that even though there are specialist sheep and tillage systems, majority of the emissions are being driven by cattle enterprise on those farms. Similar to greenhouse gases, look, the ammonia result on a per farm basis, the temporal result is very similar. It's identical almost, in that the non-dairy systems are static, are declining, whereas the emissions per ton, ammonia emissions per ton per farm are increasing on the dairy side, essentially mimicking what's happening on the DHG side. When we look at it on a per hectare base, again, the differential is not as large as it is on a farm basis, because again, dairy farms have larger farms. Okay, the relativities remain the same between tillage and dairy because they have similar farm sizes, but on a per hectare basis, cattle is about, dairy is about twice that of cattle and 3 times that of tillage on a per hectare basis. Similar to greenhouse gases, when you look at ammonia emissions per euro of output, in tillage on top, because of the lower emissions, the lower level of emissions plus are second in terms of economic revenue generation, whereas cattle, or the sheep and dairy are quite similar in terms of the long-term trend. Okay, sheep has lower emissions but lower revenue generating capacity, whereas dairy has higher emissions but also higher revenue generating capacity. Cattle on top, second highest emissions and very low revenue generating capacity to offset that. So that's the more interactive with the economic sustainability metric. So moving on to risk to water quality, again, nitrogen and phosphorus balance is based on an input-output based accounting. So we're tracking what's coming in through the farm gate in terms of feed and fertilizers, and what's going out on the far side in terms of meat and milk. And what's left in the middle is essentially a risk. It's a risk of being lost. So it's kind of all other things being equal, pressure on the local environment. All other things being equal covers a lot when we're talking about water quality. Also reporting some nitrogen and phosphorus use efficiency metrics. Again, the ones in red are kind of absolute emissions, whereas the ones in blue are emissions intensity. I'm going to, because of the time constraints today, I'm going to just concentrate on the nitrogen element of risk to water quality. If you're interested in the phosphorus ones, it's included in the report. Okay, so end balance, essentially it's inputs versus outputs on a per hectare basis. So again, look, the dairy, because they're operating at a higher level of intensity, they have much higher end surpluses compared to the non-dairy systems. You're looking at about 3 to 4 times higher than the other systems. It tends to maybe jump around a small bit. Imbalance is very much affected by the weather. Some of the better balances tends to happen in good weather years. This improvement tends to happen in poor weather years. So we saw a big shock there in 2018 with the drought and so on. End use efficiency is more of an agronomic measure, how much of the nitrogen has been retained in the farm system, and it's on a percentage basis. Okay, tillage is very much out in its own here because it doesn't have the nitrogen going through an animal essentially most of the time on our livestock on those farms, but their emissions, their end use efficiency is stronger because the tillage side of it, it's up around 60, 65, 70% year on year. The sheep tends to be around 25, 30, and the dairy and the cattle vary between 20 and 25, again, depending on the year. Better years, weather-wise, the end use efficiency tends to be higher. I'm finishing up the last couple of slides now. I just want to say that there is a trade-off between emissions intensity and absolute emissions. So at the top there, we have, we're demonstrating kilograms of output, be it milk or live weight, beef or sheep, per kilogram of end surplus. So it's kind of the end footprint. And at the bottom is the end balance per kilogram of end surplus per hectare. Again, we divide it out by top and middle and bottom. I suppose the key point I want to make here is that the better performing farmers economically tend to have lower emissions footprint as seen by the top 3 diagrams, but they also have the highest absolute emissions as seen by the bottom 3 diagrams. Okay, so ongoing work. Look, there is a PhD student looking at a life cycle analysis beef model in Moore Park. I'm hoping to plug that into the National Farm Survey, but beef side is, because it's so heterogeneous, is proven tricky. But we are working on that. We are looking at also developing a biodiversity indicators through the National Farm Survey. There is a project led by John Flynn out of Johnstown. It's called EU Smart Agri Hubs Project, where we've looked at developing an index with 300 farms in the National Farm Survey using kind of remote sensing type methodologies like LIPUS and aerial photography. That phase of the work has been complete, but we also we're hoping to ground truth John was hoping to ground truth the remote results by going on 30 farms and actually put boots in the ground and walk the habitats which were identified at an aerial level. But due to COVID-19, that's been essentially been halted. But as soon as things free up again, we're hoping to continue that. And we do, we recognise that we need, that there's a gap there, and we are working on filling that gap in terms of the biodiversity indicators. Okay, so to finish up, a summary conclusion slide on the economic and social metrics. Dairy is performing the strongest. It's not new, but it's there for all to be seen. On the environmental metrics, generally speaking, the 19 results kind of reverted back to its a steady state trend back to 2017 levels, because we had a weather shock in 18 based on the drought. In terms of absolute GHG and ammonia emissions in 19, look, we're seeing a continued increase on dairy farms. It's creeping up year on year on a year-on-year basis. The other farm systems are static and towards the end of the time period are slightly declining, which is offsetting some of the increase on the dairy side. In terms of emission intensity of production, both on the GHG and the ammonia side, on a kilogram of product basis, generally their farmers are improving their footprint, and when it comes to producing a kilogram of milk or meat. On the dairy farm side, look at the output per cow is increasing, which is good. The emissions intensity or the footprint is declining, which is good. But the absolute emissions has been driven by increases in herd size. And look, it's important to note in the innovation side, we are collecting data now on things like predicted urea and low emission slurry spreading, so we can track, some of our marginal abatement cost curve measures to see what's happening, year on year on a farm level, what's been adopted. So that's the end of my presentation. So I'll hand you back to Kevin, who's going to chair the Q&A session.
Thank you, Cathal. So I'd like to encourage everybody who's out there listening in and looking in on the seminar to please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to send in your questions. We have a few questions already. The first was from a colleague, John McNamara, who was asking whether or not it would be possible to develop an indicator on health and safety issues that we could add to our indicator set in terms of tracking that social sustainability dimension of Irish agriculture through time. And I think we'll let Trevor ask that one. And we've a comment from a retired colleague, Tim Gleeson, and it asks, has anyone calculated how much carbon would be saved in the world if Ireland doubled its milk production and exported it to markets, I guess, where the locally produced product would have a higher carbon footprint? So I'll ask either Trevor, the director, Jerry Boyle, or Cathal to chip in on that, and encourage everybody out there to ask some more questions as we answer those ones.
I'll give you my 2 cents on both of those questions, Kevin. In respect to the first one, John, about including measures in respect of farm safety and wellness, I think the key issue for us in the short term is our capacity to collect even the base set of data that we've talked about in the presentation today. I mean, our resource capacity is limited and has been stretched because of the restrictions in place due to COVID-19. So we've actually had to refuse quite a number of requests in the short term to collect what we call additional data as part of our supplementary survey that we provide normally on an annual basis, but which couldn't take place in fact this year. And that is because the process of getting and collating data on individual farms, which would normally be a process that takes place in the farm household, can no longer take place in the farm household. And that just means that the process of getting all the paperwork and verifying all of the numbers is more time consuming. So, we have to also make decisions in terms of the data we collect in terms of its overall usefulness. within the data set that we already have. Ideally, we like to collect data that can be cross-referenced against data that we already have in the farm survey. Whether data around farm safety could be collected through other means, I think has to be considered as well, and whether it would need to be part of the overall suite of data that we would have as part of our NFS data collection. On the second question, I'm not aware that anyone has, Tim, answered the question that you've asked. I guess from my perspective, what I would say to you is, okay, even if we take it as given, your suggestion that Irish milk production displacing milk production from other countries would lead to an emissions saving, we also need to take into account that greenhouse gases are not the only form of pollution that is generated by dairy activity. And the reality is that additional production in this country, whether it's of, will generate greenhouse gases, but it will also generate other form of pollutants. And it's we in Ireland that will have to deal with those other forms of pollutants. And, just at a pan-European level, the European Union can continue to increase its agricultural activity in general and contribute to overall global food security. But there is this question of whether the European Union should be doing that within the boundaries of what's feasible from an environmental perspective. So it shouldn't be that in the end, the European Union maximizes its food production at the expense of the environment in Europe. So there are wider considerations apart from the implications of what it would mean for greenhouse gas emissions in terms of increasing any form of agricultural activity in the European Union.
Thanks, Trevor. I mean, we've got lots of questions coming in, so I'm just going to try to give you a bundle at a time. And I'll answer the first one myself. Hannah Quinn Mulligan asks whether the basic payment is included in our measure of economic viability, and it is. That's just a statement, a quick question. It is in there in the family farm income definition. In terms of other questions that have been asked, Ryan McGuire asks, have we done anything to look at the sequestration profile of the farms in the farm survey? And Trevor, I'll let you answer that one.
It's an interesting question because it's one that we were just discussing.
Yeah.
The feasibility of yesterday. One thing we're interested in looking at is whether it might be possible using the remote sensing approach that's been now used for biodiversity to also be able to measure the sequestration that's taking place with respect to forestry that exists on farms. We don't have enough information as things stand in respect of forestry to be able to do that. We have information on the area of forestry on farms, but in order to measure the sequestration, you would need more information to do that, which in the ordinary sense would cost you a lot of money to do because you might have to send somebody out to actually inspect the plot that's there to make an assessment of how much sequestration could be taking place, looking at the tree varieties, their age and the tree density and what have you. Whether it could be done more affordably is something that we're interested in exploring. And if that could be done, then that's something that we would be interested in trying to incorporate in the future. So it could be a work in progress this time next year.
As always, the indicator set is based on the best science as it's being developed and robustly assessed. And then there's a necessary kind of balance to be struck in terms of how we actually do that assessment across 800 or 900 farms in the farm survey. So there's also a science in terms of actually striking that balance. Michael Maroney, I'm going to bundle a few questions, Trevor, if you don't mind, and Cathal and Jerry, jump in if you want to. Do your GHG figures include input from farm contractors in terms of the use of fuel? And if so, how is this measured? Just hold on to that one, Trevor, for a minute. We have an interesting question from Aurélie Aubry, which is, the metrics that Cathal was showing. Cathal, you might want to answer this one. Indicated lots of variability in terms of performance across the farm systems and both within the farm systems. And she was asking, where is the biggest sort of space to grab some of that improvement from better farm practices, I guess. Jack Nolan, our colleague from the Department of Agriculture, I think, is asking us whether we've looked at water quality trends in areas where this dairy expansion that we've observed in recent years has taken place. And I guess that, Cathal, you might want to comment on that. That sort of speaks to some of the work that's going on within the agricultural catchments program, as well as in the farm survey. And Elizabeth McGowan asks, interesting question, I guess, maybe straying beyond the remit of the farm survey. The farm survey is asking you, in terms of the social sustainability, whether or not we need to look at the issue of the provision of nutrients to the general population as an important dimension of livestock agriculture production's environmental and social sustainability, and could it be factored in going forward? And I know we have research in Teagasc that's looking at that. I give a shout out to my colleague Sinead McCarthy. So let's take that bundle to start with, if we wouldn't mind.
Okay, I might start with that first question in respect of fuel use. What gets counted? For the purposes of what we're doing, we're using this IPCC-based approach. So the fuel usage on farms, in terms of farmers' purchases of fuel, will get included. But as I understand it, what we don't have incorporated there would be fuel use by contractors, because we wouldn't have the information on that. What we would have money expended by contractors. Do you want to comment on that, Cathal?
That's right. The calculation actually does include an estimation of the fuel use. We have a amount of money contract that the farmer spends on contractors. So we do an adjustment to how much of that is fuel, how much of that is based on fuel. I kind of work back in terms of how much GHG is generated from that. So it is included in the overall measure. Like you've said, it's probably a very small component of the overall GHG emissions on the average farm, but I suppose it is in there. I don't know if you want to come further on that, Trevor.
No, that's fine. I was just going to say that we don't have the measured figure. We have an approximated figure, ultimately derived from expenditure.
What about this question about the spread in terms of performance and the area for greatest improvement potential that Aurélie was asking?
Yeah, I think across all the systems you see a huge distribution of results, and look at it's a very complex question to see how much room for improvement is there, because the farmers are working on different soil types, different weather conditions, under different capital and labor conditions. So look, there is clearly some room for improvement, but technology and so on can help. But look, the biophysical conditions will constrain some of the potential there. Not all dairy farmers can reach the top percentile, based on the prevailing conditions. Also, you think look at some of the systems like cattle and sheep. They're on hill farms and so on, so they're never going to be able to replicate what's going on in lowland farms. So, but there is some room, and there's always some room for improvement. But not everyone's going to be able to reach the top of the pile based on their biophysical constraints. In terms of Jack's question, in terms of water quality trends at a local level, the National Farm Survey is nationally based, and we do some regional analysis, but we're not at the level where we can look at a rate one to the other. I suppose I'll refer to the Ag Catchments program, where they have looking at this in terms of their Timoree catchment, in West Cork, and looking at the trends there in dairy expansion. So there are data in there, but the National Farm Survey not really in a position. The sample is set up to look at it at a more micro level to high level regional analysis.
The Teagasc Research Insights seminar series is ongoing, and in the next 2 months there will be seminars on land use from colleagues within the CELIP program in Teagasc and our own rural economy program, and some of those issues about the catchment program and the changes in farmer behavior and farming intensity at the catchment scale will be discussed. So I would tune into that seminar series for more information on that in due course. The final one was about this idea of nutrient supply and provision to the general population as an indicator. Trevor, do you want to see if you can answer that one quickly before we go on to the other question?
Yeah, I guess the key issue there really is one of whether the data we're collecting is relevant in terms of that question, in the sense that, you know, if you look at what's produced in Ireland versus what's consumed in Ireland, then, you know, those two things don't match up particularly well. So the, you know, the nutrients that are produced from agriculture and activity in Ireland are not a good measure of what it is that ultimately gets consumed. If we were in a world where the only thing people consumed was agricultural products produced in their own country, then that type of a metric would be very relevant for citizens of that country. But that's not the situation we're in. You know, we are in a world where there is a global trading environment in terms of agri-food. So I think that is more a demand side kind of question, whereas what we're looking at here is the supply of agricultural outputs.
I would encourage listeners to Google Sinead McCarthy, who has done some really interesting work on the sort of the embedded emissions profile of diets in Ireland, and how healthier diets might have a different profile in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So just to give that shout out, Charles O'Donnell, I'm going to ask another few questions that have come in. Charles O'Donnell asks, would it be fair to say that farmers are improving their emissions intensity, are able to do so because they have the income to reinvest in more sustainable practices? So that was sort of, is there a difference in terms of the dynamics of the sustainability metrics that are kind of positively correlated with the incomes earned or not earned across the different farm systems? And our colleague from the CELIP program, Carl Richards, asks about the end surpluses on our top dairy farms being very high, and asking what's the main driver of those end surplus differences between farms. So I might ask Cathal to answer that, and Cathal perhaps to comment on whether or not there's a relationship between that sort of improvement in environmental sustainability over time and the income dimension.
I guess the first question, is that there seems to be some sort of relationship between income and best practice adoption, but some of the practices we're talking about are actually cost savings. You know, so it's not just a cost issue. It's more kind of wider issues, sociological issues probably, are non-profit issues at play when it comes to adoption of practices. In terms of the end surpluses, essentially they've been driven by intensity. The more stocked the more stocked farms tend to have the higher surpluses. There's a correlation between intensity and surplus.
Okay, thanks, Cathal. I mean, there's lots more questions coming in. We're just gone past the hour of the seminar. There's still 150 people listening, so we might take another 5 or so minutes if the participants are happy with that, to answer a few more questions. Orly Aubrey again comes back with a question as to whether carbon sequestration is sort of netted out of the gross emissions in terms of our indicators. Cathal, you might think about answering that one quickly if you can.
Yeah, as Trevor mentioned earlier, we're not sequestration isn't in there yet.
Yeah. An anonymous attendee, that's a pity you don't have the name, but asks whether, you know, makes a statement first and then asks a question. Their statement is that feeling that the expanding dairy herd is continuously seen as a negative, and they're asking how we manage the negative implications of that expansion in terms of its damage or its environmental impact. Cathal, I think you can answer that if you wish to, and then Neil Brady asks, with an increasing amount of consumers looking to reduce their consumption of animal-derived products for perceived health or environmental benefits by switching to plant alternatives, how do you feel the Irish farmers are positioned to respond to these market dynamics? I think that's a question that goes beyond the space of our sustainability report, and I would just state that the farmers are in the marketplace. They're businessmen and women, and some are responding to that by shifting system, but you know, most aren't yet. I think, Director, you'd like to chip in with an answer to that question, maybe? And Myla McPhail asks whether we have, within the indicator set, an ability to distinguish between our conventional farming systems and organic farming systems. Trevor, you might want to answer that one, please.
Okay.
Kevin,
Yeah, Director,
Sorry.
on the
No,
plant
just
versus animal.
Kevin, on the well, there was two questions there that are kind of high level and critically important questions. One was on the dairy cow expansion, and I guess there's a couple of responses to that. I think one very important feature in the current report is we managed to separate out methane, and I think that's very important because obviously there's an ongoing scientific deliberation on the contribution of methane to global warming. But nonetheless, the increase in numbers is in dairy cow numbers is a problem. Obviously, mitigating factor would be that it would be offset by downward trend in other cattle. We are certainly looking also at the possibility of including the production of methane as a trait in cattle breeding. And of course, thirdly, and it is of course the continued drive to reduce the intensity of greenhouse gas production and ammonia per kilogram of product. Of course, that's holding, if you like, everything else constant.
Yeah.
I think the question of the health benefits that are being claimed for plant-based products versus livestock products, of course, there's a healthy debate going on as to that very point. I think it's certainly more complicated than maybe has been presented. But of course, we have the advantage in Ireland of having a very diverse export market. And there are varying responses to the consumer perception of livestock products across the globe. And so therefore, even if there were a significant retraction in demand in some markets, I think it will be more than offset by expansion in other markets. But we are doing research within Teagasc. We're looking at alternative proteins and the blending of plant and meat-based proteins. So, I mean, that's another strategy that I think will be pursued by the industry. Thank you.
Thanks, Director. I mean, there's some of the subsequent questions in the timeline are asking about what we're doing in terms of improving that story on the emissions intensity, and you've answered those in your remarks there. Anonymous person asks about the do we take into account the carbon footprint related to the feed inputs into our system? And Cathal, I think you can answer that one pretty quickly in the sense of what we do within the IPCC methodology and within the LCA one that you also highlighted.
No, the IPCC is as a high-level national accounting framework, it doesn't, but the LCA one does take account of the feed inputs. So it's a deeper look of the input side on that. Yeah, on the organic one, I might just say that, you know, as Trevor might comment as well, that I don't think we have a huge amount of organic farms in the survey. So I don't know if any kind of valid comparison is actually possible with non-organic farms.
No, we would have to engage in what we would call purposive sampling. Our sample at the moment is a stratified random sample, and on that basis, we are not going to, because of the sampling methodology, pick up a sufficient number of organic farms to be able to make the comparison that Cathal is talking about. We'd have to engage in a form of purposive sampling where we would deliberately try to build up the number of organic farms that are in the survey. A lot of these questions about could you do this, could you do that, are resource questions, and we are resource constrained in the way that any other type of activity is constrained, and we have to pick priorities as always in terms of any new areas that we can move into, and that is not one that we have delved into to this point. It may well be in the future, given the direction that policy is moving in at an EU level.
Yeah, I mean, I think given the sort of the elements within the farm to fork strategy in terms of the target set for organic land and farmers participating in organic production systems, that might well be in an indicator set in a number of years. We're almost out of time. I mean, if there are questions that I haven't gotten to quite yet, we'll be happy to follow up with people directly if they email me or Trevor or Cathal directly. The final question I think is on pesticide usage. and whether we have that as an indicator in our environmental indicator set, or are thinking about incorporating it in the future.
The answer to that question is no. I mean, what we would have to this point is information on how much money is spent on pesticides, which is not a good way of determining what pesticides are actually being purchased. We're aware it's an issue. We're also aware that it's not a trivial issue to address. And what I mean by that is that you have, you know, if you go and ask a farmer about what pesticides he might be using, the ability of the farmer to be able to categorize those under brand names into particular chemicals or what have you may well be limited. So it would be something that would have to be done with, in my view, some professional assistance, or there would need to be some professional training required to be able to identify from a suite of chemicals what exactly is what, so that we can categorize all these things correctly. Again, because of the direction of travel in terms of policy, this may be something that we find ourselves having to do in future. You know, it is an obvious consideration with respect to the environmental sustainability.
Thanks, Trevor. And listen, I'd like to thank all of our three speakers in the seminar today for taking part. Director Cathal and Trevor, thank you very much. And I'd like to remind all the people, we still have 140 or so people watching, that the report is now on the Teagasc website. If you go to the publications section of the Teagasc website, it's there to be downloaded. The slides that we've used today, Cathal and Trevor have used, will also be available. And I understand that we're recording this seminar, so that will also be available for people to rewatch at their leisure in due course. So keep an eye, as always, on Teagasc's website, www.teagasc.ie, for material like this and for really other really interesting seminars. So I'd like to thank everybody. Thank you for coming along virtually, and our three speakers today. And I wish you a productive day. Okay, bye-bye. Stay safe.
Bye-bye, everyone.